Hello, I'm Evelyn Calugay. I'm a member of PINAY. PINAY is a Filipino women's organization who advocates and fights for the right of migrant workers, especially women, Filipino women, and other women who are in the Live-In Caregiver Program. Um, we empower them to fight for their rights and to fight for social justice.
My name is Jill Hanley. I've been involved with the Immigrant Workers Center since it started 15 years ago, and I'm a professor at the School of Social Work at McGill. I've been involved over these years on housing issues and immigrant rights, and been involved in different campaigns like CSST for domestic workers, working for the rights of temporary foreign workers. And I've been involved as well over the years in different sort of international solidarity work, for example, Center for Philippine Concerns. I was involved in the movements around the free trade of the America Agreement. I've been involved in a lot of different things over the years.
What were your observation in the social movement in Quebec?
So I came to Montreal when I was 18. I had already been an activist, very active since I was 13 or something in the anti-nuclear movement in Ottawa, and getting involved in environmental organizations, but always youth-oriented, and I was very involved in that. When I came to McGill, I became more involved in international solidarity kind of work. And when I first came to Montreal, I was a McGill student. And for the first 3 years that I was a McGill student, I stayed pretty focused on the McGill campus, and I was getting involved in student stuff and that kind of thing. But as I was getting to the end of my degree, I was feeling like I wanted to stay in Montreal, and I wanted to get to know the bigger city more. And I decided to volunteer at Project Genesis, which is a social rights organization in Côte-des-Neiges. And I became a storefront advisor there. So in doing that, I became, first of all, they train you on all the social benefits that exist. So I learned all about, pensions and welfare and housing rights and all this kind of stuff. But in doing that, every day you're meeting, 10 people who are living the effects of these social policies. So at that time I started to see some of the differences between the social policies in Quebec and the rest of Canada, but also becoming really aware of how those, the effects of our policies on regular people, and seeing what difference it makes when people don't have enough money to do what they need to do in their lives. And Côte-des-Neiges is a really heavily immigrant neighborhood too, so I was seeing a lot of people that maybe their language skills were making it hard for them to defend their rights, or they were facing discrimination in housing or in work and that kind of stuff. And it got me really thinking about continuing the kind of anti-racist stuff and immigrant rights stuff that I was interested in Ottawa. Project Genesis is an interesting organization. It is an Anglophone basis organization that does social rights defense on an individual level, but always trying to link it to the community level. So they try and learn from the casework that they do to bring it onto the public level to do organizing and advocacy, and bring the perspectives of the people they work with through their own involvement and organizing to the provincial and the federal level. So for me, that was like the first introduction to sort of social movements in Montreal. And it brought me, out of McGill into Côte-des-Neiges, and then through Project Genesis, I got to see all the coalitions like Frappru, the housing coalition, that had amazing songs and great demonstrations, really creative and very militant, in their housing defense, and the welfare rights groups. And anyway, that showed me about that. At the end of my years at McGill, it was 1995, and it was the summer that they were doing the Marche des Femmes, the Women's March, the Bread and Roses Women's March from Montreal to Quebec City. Did you get involved in that?
Yes,
Yeah.
we did. We joined 2 marches in Quebec City, and PINAY has been trying to integrate the mainstream Quebec organization. So that's why we joined the Fédération des Femmes. So that the memorable date that you can think of on your early involvement?
Well, yeah, for me this was one really important thing that I did. So I joined that march from Montreal to Quebec City. I couldn't go the whole way to Quebec City because I had to come back and go to work, but it was a total immersion for me in this sort of Quebec women's movement. So up until then I'd been involved at McGill and at Project Genesis, which is still a pretty Anglo organization, but this was like the Quebec women's movement, super Québécoise, very militant, and just like a whole other world that I didn't know anything about. So getting involved in that, I heard about like women's groups from all over the province, and it was in the years around the referendum, and so there was a lot of talk about that kind of stuff. And as an Anglophone who wanted to live in Montreal but had grown up outside, it was a whole eye-opening thing to talk to people about what their thoughts were about the referendum and this kind of stuff. I was really impressed at how strong that network of women's organizations was. But I also lived a little bit of culture shock just because if you don't know a lot of Québécois, you don't hear their perspectives on sovereignty. And, you know, coming from outside of Quebec, I thought like sovereignty was like this great big evil thing. Mm-hmm. And I remember on the march at one point, Jacques Parizeau came and joined the march, and he marched with Françoise David at the front, and I was completely horrified and scandalized, and I was like, should I leave the march? And I actually asked some people about it, and they were saying, well, Jill, he's the elected representative. Like, whatever you think of him, the Quebecers voted him, and why shouldn't we, you know, have a talk with him while we walk through his town? Anyway, so it was a real eye-opening thing for me, and it made me feel like, even though I had a lot of culture shock on that thing, I loved it, and I still felt welcome and like I wanted to learn from that, and I really admired the women that organized that. So it made me feel more connected to Quebec than I did before, and it made me feel even more like I wanted to stay. So then after, when the referendum actually happened, and it was rough times in terms of like relationships between French and English in Montreal, I felt like it didn't sum it up. There is still more important things in terms of social rights that people had in common.
Is there any other social movement or actions that you have been involved that you have been attached to?
The organizing around the Free Trade of the Americas Agreement was something that really marked my feelings about organizing and the state, basically. But, you know, that was a really big mobilization in Quebec that involved a huge range of groups. So there were, you know, all the unions were involved, the women's organizations, every social rights organization, everybody was involved, and a lot of student activists too, and just a massive mobilization, at least a year of preparation going into it to go to Quebec City where the summit was happening. And there was like two sides to my feelings about it. On the one hand, it was really amazing to see the range of people that were involved and how many people felt strongly about this, and the issues that were at hand were about, you know, being able to make decisions around social rights and public investment and civil rights and, anyway, important stuff. And then how difficult it was to bring all those groups together. So there was all this ideological debate going on around that about what was the proper way to organize, and should it be, direct action or less confrontational, and what were the implications for who could be there and all that kind of stuff. Anyway, for all that happening, when it actually came to the days in Quebec City, the actual summit, and everybody was there, I was just completely horrified at the government response to it. It was so violent and so much. I think this was in recent years, like for my generation anyway, the first show of like massive government response with tear gas and riot police and chasing after people and like preventative arrests and stuff like that. Just really oppressive stuff. A lot of us came back from that saying, I really want to get involved in this housing organization. I want to work with the people in this neighborhood, and I want to work on social rights in a concrete way, but then be connected to bigger things. And I came back even more committed to the Immigrant Workers Center and wanting to like have it survive and make it through and always be there. So, because I know that these things are going to keep coming back and it's going to affect us in different ways. So if I can contribute here and really make this a solid place, then that's a good contribution. And I hope other people are doing that in other issues, and we want to be linked to them, It's kind of attractive to talk about big ideas, but it's so abstract that I think you can get lost in that and not have the same kind of impact as you can have if you're building from the base and really working with, people who are living the effects of these policies.
Do you think there's a connection or a link between what's happening in the base and the one that's happening on the higher level of their summits, what their policies internationally is put in place?
I think working at the Immigrant Workers Center, we definitely see that. It's clearly a topic that's linked to international forces, because why are people migrating in the first place? It's because the economies where they're from, or the security where they're from is gone. So they need to migrate to have a safer life or have a better life economically. It's not out of nothing. And big international agreements contribute to that. I think like free trade agreements contribute to that. And then we have the Canadian policy that's, trying to bring in migrants to do certain types of work without giving the same type of rights necessarily as we would like people to have. So we definitely see a link, and I think we want our work to have a connection to that. We need to learn about that, and we need our experience on the ground doing the organizing and then the work on that to get fed back to inform it. But it doesn't mean everybody in the organization has to be doing that all the time. It's maybe more through representation of someone from the organization, but we still want to be connected on the ground here where we are, But we are connected to international, like the International Migrants Alliance. We're part of Canadian coalitions that are working on migration issues. So we stay involved, but it's like we always want to keep the groundwork going.
PINAY started being with the Immigrant Workers Center when it opened up. Mm. So I really saw the expansion of the Immigrant Workers Center. Even if it didn't have money, it survived. So I would like you to explain more about how it is still working without resources, financial resources, but the human resources is there.
So I got involved in that in 1999. There were already people working on it a bit before, but I think it's important to know that center came together because there were two people, Tess Tessalona and Marco Luciano, and they were union organizers from Filipino background. And so they were working for a union, but they were also organized through Filipino rights organizations. And when they were doing their union organizing, what they were finding was they were using traditional union tactics to organize workplaces. So the blitz tactic, where you go in quick, you get everybody to sign the union cards. And then once everyone signed the cards and they actually got the union, there wasn't necessarily a lot of follow-up from the union to like keep it strong, not let the people be divided among them. And what they were seeing is that in big workplaces, there was ethnic divisions between the workers that the employers were taking advantage of to destroy the union. So they were seeing a pattern of like they would go in and organize a workplace, and then 5 years later or 3 years later, that union would be gone because the employer was successful in getting the different worker groups to fight it with each other and get rid of the union. They invited some people to come together and look at if we could create a center that would be a community space for workers from different ethnic backgrounds to meet and, have access to popular education about what their labor rights are, to talk about migration issues and unionization, but a space that was going to be safe outside the workplace. They wanted to unionize, but they felt like they needed another space to let people get to know each other and work on issues even if unionization didn't work. And maybe it could support unionization if people needed to get to know each other. So we were able to pull it together. We got a grant from one union, the Canadian Auto Workers, right at the beginning that helped us open. We opened in 2000, and we have managed to survive, but we have never ever had any kind of core funding. We've never even had any renewable funding. So for 15 years, we've operated on real shoestring or employability grants with people that are basically activists taking a low salary to do it, volunteers. We rely a lot on students to do a lot of the legwork, but we have really solid activists that have been involved the whole time. Immigrant Workers Center has a kind of, a bit of a unique position, I think, because it is on the one hand, it's a community group, but we have good ties with the more informal activist, student type organizing around immigrant rights, for example, and about labor issues to some degree. And then we also have pretty good relations with other community groups that do like places like Project Genesis or the South Asian Women's Community Center and Au Bas de l'Échelle. And we also have relationships with unions that are pretty good. So I don't think there's a lot of groups that span those three types of alliances. And I feel like that's something that's really helped us. Like as a center, we're committed to that, to continue to have those links.
How, with the new changes in the immigration policies, since you're working at the Immigrant Worker Center, or your volunteer work is focused in the Immigrant Worker Center, how did it influence your activism?
When the Immigrant Worker Center was first getting started in 1999, 2000, there was still, it was like the assumption was that Canada's immigration policy was about permanent settlement, that it was about people coming to stay here and integrate. So of course, there's racism, there was all kinds of discrimination, there were problems, but the basic sort of public narrative, like what people said was, we have permanent immigration. And then we had 9/11, and then so that led to a real restriction on refugees. So that, we have a quarter of the number of refugee claimants that we had before that. And then there's been a real complete shift away from permanent immigration towards temporary migration. And I feel like none of us really know what this is going to do, but I think it's a pretty major shift. Like we're not saying to people arriving, welcome, join in. We're saying stay for as long as we need you and then see you later. And then it has all kinds of implications for their families that often get left behind. And so I feel like this is really major. Organizing wise, it means like that on terms of immigration policy, the organizing has been so much around fighting cuts and not about proposing new things or making things better. It's about just saving the ground, and like so much organizing around just stopping individual deportations and like horror story after horror story of individuals, and then trying to have some kind of impact on the policy. But it's just been a sweep towards more and more precarious situations for migrants. And I don't feel like the general public really has this sense that this has changed, but that, to me, that's like a really fundamental difference in like social project. Really different. And in terms of organizing workers, when we started, we didn't organize temporary foreign workers, and today that's like half of what we're doing. And that's really difficult, because before, when we were organizing workers in a workplace, there was relative stability in that workplace, right? So like a lot of those people might work there for 10 years and they would live in Montreal and stay in Montreal. So you had more continuity in the organizing. But now we're looking at organizing temporary foreign workers that are often on 6-month, 1 year, 2 year contracts, but you might only meet them in the last year of it or something. So you don't necessarily have a lot of time to work with someone before they leave. And then how do you keep the momentum on the organizing going with leaders among temporary foreign workers is really hard. Mm-hmm. It takes a lot of time and investment on a personal level to work with people, to have them organize like that. And then the other half of what we're doing is agency workers. So immigrants are really overrepresented in placement agency work. And that makes it hard to organize too, because they aren't in the same workplace for very long, or their position in that workplace is so vulnerable that it's really hard to organize. So on both cases, the change in economic practices and immigration policy have made the organizing itself really difficult. That being said, we're doing more organizing now than we were when we started. We're stronger now than we were when we started. So we're doing it, but it's really hard. Yeah. In terms of being an mostly English-speaking organization, that's something that has kind of changed over the years too. Because I think when we first started, there was probably a stronger sense, I feel like, so that's 15 years ago now. I feel like there's a stronger sense of like there being Anglophone immigrant communities and Francophone immigrant communities. I think today, partly as a good side effect of Bill 101, there's more English-speaking immigrant kids learning French. And so the younger people are bilingual, and it's making those communities, I think, become more integrated into I just feel like the language thing is not as big a deal now as it was when we started. And the other thing that's changed is that there's so many more Spanish speakers. And so there's less of an English-French thing, and we have an English-French-Spanish happening. Like today, we are mostly an English-speaking organization, but we have many people that are bilingual or trilingual, and there's many languages being spoken at the center all the time. And I think that as Anglophones also, we're probably more, and maybe this is like getting away from the referendum years or something, we're more sensitive to speaking French and making more effort to do our things in French, and starting things in French and then speaking English in public events and stuff like this. Like I think we're a little more understanding of the importance of respecting French in Quebec, and just feeling comfortable with that.
Is there any problem that how people work together as in the center?
I mean, there are still challenges you see in big coalitions and stuff like this, like I think when you get beyond the sort of one-on-one kind of level and you're trying to participate in provincial level stuff or coalition level stuff, it becomes a little more difficult because there's a couple of things. I think one is, I mean, if your French is not really strong, sometimes just the pace of the conversation and the slang and stuff like that can be hard to follow, and it can be hard to jump in at the right moment because you're still processing. So that's like, your French is not good enough, that can be hard, and there's not always a real sensitivity to that, whether you're Anglophone or if you speak other languages, whatever. It's just at a higher level of activity and they're rolling along, so it can be hard to insert yourself.
From your perspective, is language a meaningful aspect of history of Quebec social movement over the last 50 years?
I mean, it's just a fact in Quebec, I think, that it is, I think it's legitimately an important thing. Like I was saying, I feel like at the Immigrant Workers Center, our attitude has changed over the last 15 years in terms of, like, at the beginning being more sort of defensive and feeling like we had to fight for English access to things and stuff like this. And I think that feeling has gone down a bit, and like, it's the other side of it is for us to, I think people have come to a better understanding of why that tension exists, and that there is a real historical basis for it, and that there's a lot of obnoxious Anglophones who refuse to speak French when like, just out of respect, it's nice to to try and speak the language of the people you're trying to talk with, right? So if you can go both ways, it really makes a big difference. So
what motivated you, Jill, to become an activist?
my parents were really Catholic, and I grew up in sort of a Catholic community, but my parents were always, sort of their main message was that everybody deserves respect and caring, and that we have responsibility to take part in that. So they did in their lives, and they encouraged us to. And they didn't believe in the more exclusive kind of Catholic doctrine. So that was part of it. And I think I also just feel like what else should we be here if it's not to make things better, right? I really feel like I think part of also being passionate about activism and organizing and stuff is believing that people are really amazing. You know what I mean? Like when you do organizing with people and you see people that are living something difficult and you're part of a group and you sort of come above that and you see past that and you see people like changing and gaining confidence and wanting to do something and make a contribution, it's really amazing.
Jill, can you give a piece of advice to young activists who are just starting so they will stay committed to the movement, social movement in Quebec?
It's a hard one because I think there's so many things that people can do, and also I don't feel like I have like some big answer for people, but I think one thing that's really useful is to try and understand how your involvement is connected to a longer term struggle. So to realize that people have been working on this before you got there, and that you hope the work's going to keep going for a long time involving you, or even if you're no longer there. So to try and see it as part of a movement, and not just an event, or not just a campaign, and not just because you have a class, that you really see yourself as part of a continuing struggle. And I think that way you learn from people that have been around, and you can be there when new people come later on. I think that makes a big difference.